In every generation, there is a chosen one. He alone will stand against the movies, the television shows, and the forces of, entertainment. He is the podcaster.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to On Screen. I'm your host, Dylan Wright, and I'm here to take you on a journey through film and television. So I decided that since I really enjoyed talking about the long history of Star Trek last week, I'm going to continue throughout the month to talk about different franchises. So it's going to be Franchise February because alliteration. And the next franchise I want to talk about, if you haven't guessed from the cheesy intro and the awesome theme music, is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Now, I call it a franchise because it did last more than one show. It had a spin-off in Angel. So I'm calling it a franchise because I really want to talk about Buffy. Judge me if you want. It's a great show. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. But until then, let's talk about The Slayer. So if you don't know, Buffy the Vampire Slayer is a show that was created by Joss Whedon, who's gone on to make Firefly, which is a fan favorite, even though it lasted one season. He directed the first two Avengers movies, wrote them. He has a huge hand in pop culture. Definitely in the past couple decades, he's been a huge mover and shaker in the pop culture universe. But the very first thing that he did that was really prevalent was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Originally, he wrote it as a movie that was released that was probably one of the campiest and corniest things I've ever seen in my life, and I don't really like to think that it exists, but it does, so I have to live with that. But then he realized that, you know what, this would make a really good TV show, so he ended up making Buffy the Vampire Slayer as a television show. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the premise is that unto every generation, a chosen one is born to fight against vampires and the forces of darkness, and they're usually imbued with these incredible powers, and they're called the Slayer. It's typically a female, and the current Slayer, when we enter the series, is Buffy Summers, played by the awesome Sarah Michelle Gellar. We see her moving into this new town of Sunnydale, and she kind of wants to just live a normal life. She doesn't really want to do the supernatural stuff, but the call is thrust upon her, as any hero's journey. It happens when she finds out that this peaceful town that she thought she moved to is on the Hellmouth, which, from the sounds of it, is not a great thing. Basically, it means that a portal to all of the darkest and evilest creatures is right underneath the town, and she picked a perfect place to move if she doesn't want to fight them. She, of course, according to the hero's journey, has to have a mentor, and she has that within Rupert Giles, the school librarian, who is part of the Watchers Council, this mysterious group of individuals who watch over and help train each Slayer as they come up in the world, since when one Slayer dies, a new one is born within another person. And, of course, there has to be a nice cavalcade of sidekicks and help, so we have Willow Rosenberg, played by the awesome Allison Hannigan, who starts off as basically like the techie person who looks up all the stuff on the computer and does all the cybernetting, since it's the early 90s and we can't have any internet without talking about cyberspace and the interwebs. Eventually she gets into magic stuff, and there's a lot of story plots about that, but before we get to that, we also have Xander Harris, played by Nicholas Brendan, who's kind of just the goofball that acts as most times comic relief, but sometimes he's considered the heart of the group. If you're a big Captain Planet fan, you'll know that means almost nothing most of the time. But sometimes he is helpful, and he does get the gang out of situations sometimes. Also, Cordelia Chase, played by the beautiful Charisma Carpenter. She starts off as kind of the typical mean girl, but then ends up being a really awesome character until some point in Angel, which I won't talk about. We also have Oz, played by baby Seth Green, who starts off as Willow's boyfriend and becomes a werewolf. Also, the mysterious Angel, who we don't quite know what his deal is at the beginning of the show, but we soon learn, and spoiler alert, that he's a vampire who has his soul and is trying to make amends for his past misdeeds as a vampire when he didn't have a soul. And him and Buffy eventually get into kind of a relationship. You know, it's the forbidden love. Oh, you're a vampire, so I can't love you. And, oh, you're the vampire slayer, so you're supposed to kill me. But it eventually moves past that, thankfully. There are also a couple of other characters that are introduced throughout the show. A lot of them are great, like Tara. Some of them are really annoying, like Dawn. And some of them are just okay, like Riley. But each character kind of brings something new to the table, which is really appreciated in a show that has such a big cast. You don't want any repeats or anything like that. You want characters to be distinct. And Buffy does a really good job with that. But the main group is called the Scooby Gang because we always like to have Scooby-Doo references in our stuff. And if you want a show that delves deeply into pop culture references, Buffy the Vampire Slayer is definitely the show for you. The first season deals with typical problems where high school is hell, both literally and metaphorically. We deal with stuff that happens to high schoolers as well as vampires and werewolves and witches and forces of darkness stuff. But each season basically has an overarching plot that sometimes leads into the next season, but usually each season will have its own individual big bad, short for big bad wolf, but they call them big bad because they're really cool. So the first season's big bad is called the Master, and he's this master vampire who kind of looks like Nosferatu if he drank too much Kool-Aid because he has a lot of red stuff around his mouth and also mixed with a bat. So he's pretty terrifying looking and is a pretty decent villain to start out with, despite the fact that he can't really do much because of like a magic portal or something. And each season progressively has its own big bad. Like Spike and Drusilla are in the second season, and they're this kind of Sid and Nancy vampire couple that come to terrorize Sunnydale, and they're pretty cool. And then the mayor's the bad guy in the third season, and he becomes a giant worm at the end, so that's cool. And then they eventually graduate high school in a rather explosive manner and go on to college at UC Sunnydale, where they face just this like technology-based group that wants to stop supernatural stuff. It's science versus magic, and I don't know, it's kind of the worst season in a way, but it eventually moves on to season 5, which is a really cool season that involves Buffy basically going up against a god and dealing with that. And then season 6 is my favorite season, and it's the darkest season, and dealing with the darkness within magic that sometimes occurs. And it has this trio of nerds that shows like a really real and really frightening look at what happens when like the male ego goes unchecked or the socially awkward becomes kind of threatening in a way. And it's a very scary, realistic thing that could happen when someone is spurned in a way that their mind can't handle it for some reason or another, that they think that the world is owned to them, and whenever somebody ignores them, they take it personally, and it's a very scary reality that occurs. And then season 7 is the last season, and it basically has the first evil as the main villain, and it has the power to kind of take the form of people that have already died. So you would think that's a really interesting premise, but they kind of dropped the ball with it because everybody's tired at the end of the season and they want it to be done, and you could tell that there's just like a fatigue going on with everybody. But the show does a surprisingly good job tackling real-life issues within this supernatural realm. There's a lot of really standout episodes that just showcase how amazing the show is, such as season 4's Hush, where basically most of the episode the characters aren't talking because there's a kind of a spell put on the town that prevents them from using words and talking, and they have to kind of mime out whatever they're saying. This came in as response of Joss Whedon being praised for his writing and his dialogue. He decided, you know what, I'm going to write an episode where they don't talk at all and they have to interact without words. And it really turns out amazing. And another episode that's equally as great is Once More with Feeling, which is the musical episode. Yeah, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, of course, has a musical episode, and it's one of the best episodes of the series. They're able to express to each other through song in a way that they could never while talking to each other. And there's a lot of really deep emotional revelations that happen within the episode because of this spell that everybody has to sing and dance. And it's one of the most fun episodes of the show, and it's also one of the deepest and most revealing episodes as well. There's a lot of revelations that come out of it that normally wouldn't have happened if not for this different format. So the show's not afraid to switch it up a bit in different episodes, and I think because of that, it adds so much more flavor to the show and everything around it. As a show that started out with being, high school is hell, the way it evolved to make the characters grow and progress is really interesting. And it's something that's not normally done in television. We usually have these, stagnant characters that don't have too much growth within their episodes that they appear in. But Buffy's different in that each character kind of, you can't really recognize them at the end of the series, but they still grow in a way that's natural to their characters. And that's most important in a show that really is about the characters. I love shows that deal with personal issues and character growth. I love growing up with the characters. I love seeing them go from maybe a stubborn person to a more open-minded person. I love shows that do that, and Buffy the Vampire Slayer is the prime example of how well that's done. It's also a really powerful show in terms of women empowerment. The main character is this strong female, and it turns the damsel in distress trope on its head in that the damsel is not in distress. She's actually the one that's kicking butt and taking names. It's really great to see a show that really just taps into that awesome female spirit that a lot of horror movies and things like that tend to ignore. It makes the final girl not the final girl, but the first girl in a line of more awesome girls to come. And it's really cool to see. It's an awesome, awesome show. Another awesome show, but for completely different reasons, is a sequel show, Angel, which I can't talk about on this episode of On Screen, but I will write about in the companion article, so be sure to check that out. But until then, that's all the time I have left for this episode of On Screen. If you have any suggestions for future topics, please let me know in the comments below. I would love to cover whatever you want me to. So until next time, seize the moment, because tomorrow you might be dead.